Vince McMahon's response to the Owen Hart incident reveals a chilling sociopathic tendency. He argued that the blackout during Owen's fall shielded the audience from witnessing the tragedy, allowing the show to continue without the haunting image of death lingering in their minds. To him, this was a stroke of luck, an opportunity to prioritize business over the human cost. It's a stark reflection of how he was raised, echoing the dynamics he faced growing up under his father, Vince McMahon Sr. Vince Sr. saw his son as a business asset rather than a child in need of guidance or protection. He made young Vince a ring announcer, not out of belief in his potential, but to save a few dollars. This mentality shaped Vince Jr. into someone who learned that emotions and personal connections were secondary to profit and performance. Instead of nurturing his son, Vince Sr. allowed young Vince to endure the hardships of an abusive stepfather without intervening. This lack of care and emotional support instilled in Vince a belief that the welfare of others was insignificant. In the wake of Owen's death, Vince's reaction was telling. Rather than acknowledging the tragedy and its impact on those involved, he focused solely on how to minimize damage to the business. Owen Hart's death became a footnote in the broader narrative of wrestling, and Vince's decision to keep the show going was a clear indication of where his priorities lay. It was not about honoring Owen or considering the feelings of his fellow wrestlers. It was about what would be most profitable and what would distract fans from the grim reality that had just unfolded. This pattern of behavior is not just business as usual. It's reminiscent of a trauma response. Vince learned early on that personal welfare didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. It was all about the bottom line. In his mind, the show must go on, even at the cost of human life. It's a disturbing echo of his upbringing, a cycle of neglect that turned into a lack of empathy for others. In the end, for Vince McMahon, it was never about Owen Hart. It was always about what was best for business. Dr. Jerry Graham was Vince McMahon's favorite wrestler as a kid. Bleach blonde hair, a massive frame, and the kind of bravado that made you want to light a cigarette with a $100 bill. This guy was a heel, and Vince loved him for it. He even convinced his stepmother to dye his hair bleach blonde just to match his idol. Vince would strut around, emulating Graham's swagger like it was his damn birthright. This episode kicks off with vintage footage of Graham wrestling in the 50s, while Vince reminisces about how this flamboyant, aggressive character shaped his childhood. There's a great moment when they hit the road in a slick '59 convertible, with Graham honking at anyone and everyone, ignoring red lights and barreling through intersections like a madman. Yeah, that's who I want to be, Vince thinks, and who could blame him? The narrative then cuts to the Attitude Era, showcasing Vince in all his muscular glory, before slamming us into the infamous Montreal Screwjob. Here's Vince, telling the referee that Bret Hart tapped out while the wrestling world collectively gasped. Historians argue that this moment was pivotal. Without it, professional wrestling might have flatlined in the early 2000s. This controversy turned Vince into a super heel, while Austin morphed into the ultimate babyface, igniting the highest point of the Attitude Era, the second biggest boom in wrestling history. This was also the dawn of the internet, where rumors and half-truths about backstage drama spread like wildfire. One juicy claim: Bret Hart allegedly broke Vince's jaw over the screw job. Natalia, a Canadian, chimes in, saying she really fucking hated Vince for that. Considering the match took place in Montreal, the stakes were sky high. But let's be real, it was a blessing in disguise for Vince. Sometimes you need a villain to spice things up in wrestling. Vince, in the 90s, famously quipped, "Bret screwed Bret," and that line got people wondering where the hell the lines between reality and fiction blurred. Triple H recalls that speech made fans question everything, much like Brian Pillman's infamous promo in ECW, where he unleashed a torrent of curses against Eric Bischoff and called the audience marks, comparing them to people who thought OJ didn't do it. Pillman even tried to take a piss in the ring for good measure. It's all about that mix of real-life drama and wrestling chaos that makes you lean in. Vince recognized he had a boatload of heel heat. He was the villain everyone loved to hate. So what does he do? He turns that heat into a business opportunity. Back in the 70s, his old man didn't want him wrestling or playing a character, but after the screw job, Vince finally embraced the role of the evil tyrant boss. Enter Mr. McMahon, the character that changed the trajectory of wrestling forever. In 1997, the Montreal Screwjob hit while WCW was kicking WWF's ass in the ratings. They just signed Bret Hart after he left, and Vince was faced with the harsh reality that WCW had a roster full of legends: Sting, Macho Man, Hulk Hogan, Goldberg, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Ric Flair. Meanwhile, WWF was still rolling out cartoonish characters like the Gobbledygooker and the Brooklyn Brawler. The Undertaker, in an interview, pointed out that WWF was still pandering to kids like it did in the 80s, while WCW was reaching for that coveted 1834 demographic. And while Vince was feeling the heat from the networks about plummeting ratings, he knew it was time for a seismic shift. Vince wanted to be recognized for pushing boundaries, being bold, and embracing a little chaos. During an interview, he declared that the WWF didn't want to insult fans' intelligence anymore and promised a new, edgy direction, one that wasn't just family-friendly fluff. Some folks thought it was all just a bunch of hot air, but that interview was the launch pad for the Attitude Era. One particularly memorable incident? Shawn Michaels strutted to the ring in bicycle shorts, stuffing the front of his pants, and Vince slapped him with a $10,000 fine for being unprofessional. But when HBK asked if Vince thought it was funny, the fine was magically lifted. Because let's face it, Shawn Michaels knew you could have respect for the business while still being a total lunatic. Vince would say, "Shawn Michaels, aka HBK, now that's attitude." As Triple H and Bruce Pritchard delved deeper into the evolution of the Attitude Era, it's clear that the shift wasn't a sudden transformation, but rather a gradual progression. They illustrate how the company, under Vince McMahon's leadership, began to experiment with edgier content in response to the changing landscape of television and societal norms. The montage showcases iconic moments and characters that pushed boundaries, from the controversial match between Roddy Piper and Goldust to the rebellious antics of D-Generation X. Cody Rhodes chimes in, echoing the sentiment that the anti-establishment narrative resonated deeply with fans during the 1990s. The rebellious spirit of that era was a stark contrast to the wholesome family-friendly programming of the 1980s. Triple H mentions the fine line they walked, with Vince often urging caution after particularly risque segments, fearing backlash from networks that threatened to pull the plug on their programming. Yet, as ratings soared, networks began to encourage and even demand more of the risky content that was capturing viewers' attention. The 1990s served as a backdrop for this cultural shift, marked by a growing appetite for politically incorrect humor and content that challenged societal norms. This was a time when shows like The Jerry Springer Show thrived, and wrestling took on a similar chaotic and provocative energy. The rise of rap and gang culture also played a significant role in shaping the attitudes of the era, with factions like the NWO embodying the rebellious, anti-establishment ethos that resonated with audiences. As Triple H and Pritchard reflect on the mindset of the youth during this time, they acknowledge that many children were exposed to adult themes earlier than ever before. With parents often preoccupied or absent, kids found themselves drawn to programming that spoke to their maturity and intelligence rather than condescended to them. The nostalgia is palpable as they recount their own experiences, touching on the frustrations of being limited by parental restrictions on what they could watch or play. Undertaker's poignant remark about breaking down doors and pushing boundaries encapsulates the collective mindset of the wrestlers during the Attitude Era. They were determined to reclaim their place at the top of the wrestling world, and that meant taking risks, exploring controversial narratives, and ultimately, entertaining their audience. The discussion naturally shifts to the iconic figure of Stone Cold Steve Austin, who emerges as the face of the Attitude Era. While many attribute the era's success to Vince McMahon, Austin's rise from WCW to ECW and finally to the WWF epitomizes the gritty spirit of the time. His character, heavily influenced by the edgy persona of ECW's Sandman, brought a raw authenticity to wrestling that captivated fans. The idea that a good artist borrows, while a great artist steals, resonates here, as Austin took elements from various influences and crafted a persona that was entirely his own, rewriting the rules of what a wrestling star could be. In the end, the Attitude Era wasn't just about shock value. It was a cultural phenomenon that reflected the complexities of a generation eager for authenticity, rebellion, and entertainment that spoke to their lived experiences. The stories of wrestlers like Austin, The Undertaker, and others stand as a testament to how they transformed the industry during a time when pushing boundaries was not just accepted but celebrated. As I continue to review this documentary on Vince McMahon and the Attitude Era, I can't help but reflect on why this period was so appealing, especially in the context of its counterculture relationship with the 1980s. Back then, television was overwhelmingly family-friendly, prioritizing innocence and wholesome content. My own experiences growing up in that environment resonate with this narrative. I remember my brother and I being restricted to watching PBS because our parents disapproved of anything they deemed violent or inappropriate. We felt like we were trapped in a bubble, forced to consume programming that didn't speak to our experiences or maturity. Meanwhile, many kids our age were exposed to adult-themed content, often unsupervised. Shows like The Jerry Springer Show, South Park, Beavis and Butthead, and even Ren and Stimpy were all part of a cultural landscape that was far more edgy and reflective of what we were encountering in the world around us. The dawn of the internet also played a huge role in this shift. It became so easy for kids to stumble upon adult content, further fueling the desire for programming that didn't condescend to us. When you've already been exposed to adult situations, it's hard to go back to content that tries to protect your innocence. You start feeling like it's insulting your intelligence. I recall a specific incident in high school that perfectly encapsulates this tension. My dad wouldn't let my brother and me play duck hunt because the controller resembled a gun. Yet my cousin, who was in his 40s, had no problem allowing his 3-year-old and 6-year-old daughters to play the same game. I found it puzzling that my dad was so concerned about the shape of a controller when my cousin seemed completely unbothered by what his kids were exposed to. It felt like a double standard, and it fueled a desire in me to engage with more mature content that respected my intelligence. In reflecting on the Attitude Era, I realized that it thrived because it resonated with kids like me who were looking for something that felt real and relatable. The wrestling narratives of that time, with their edgy humor and politically incorrect themes, didn't shy away from the complexities of life. Instead of trying to shield us, they embraced the reality that we were already navigating, making it all the more engaging and appealing. The Attitude Era wasn't just about shock value. It was a response to a generation eager for authenticity in a world that was quickly evolving. As I dive deeper into this documentary on Vince McMahon, I can't help but appreciate his candid admiration for ECW and the mad genius behind it. He calls it what it is, unapologetic, off the wall, and a whole lot of crazy bullshit that somehow managed to attract a rabid audience. It's no surprise that ECW became a massive influence on the Attitude Era. Vince was zeroing in on Steve Austin and ECW like a hawk. He loved Austin's ruthless character and that iconic beer-chugging moment in the ring. And here's the kicker. Austin wasn't just ripping off the Sandman. They were both doing the same wild shit in their own ways. Paul Heyman was in Austin's ear, pushing him to work his ass off and squeeze every ounce of talent out of him. It was like a developmental league before Austin made the big leap to WWE. Now, let's talk about the birth of the infamous Austin 316. Triple H was originally slated to win the King of the Ring, but got grounded for the curtain call incident, hugging a bunch of wrestlers he was supposed to be feuding with. That's a big no-no. It screws with the illusion that wrestling is real. So Vince decided to punish Triple H and handed the win to Austin instead. After Austin took the crown, he cut a promo where he flipped the script on Jake the Snake Roberts, who had just delivered a preachy sermon about John 3:16. Austin fired back with, "Austin 3:16 says I just whipped your ass." Now here's a fun fact. There were two guys dressed as jesters standing by the entrance for the King of the Ring matches, and those were none other than Matt and Jeff Hardy. Vince believed in that whole pay your dues philosophy, which is why so many wrestlers took on odd jobs before getting their shot. Vince was taken aback when Austin dropped that line, especially since they were in the Bible Belt. It could have been a PR disaster, maybe even lead to fines or canceling Austin for being unprofessional. But instead, the crowd ate it up, and Vince saw dollar signs. Austin also shared that he was inspired by Vince's commentary during that time, which led to his legendary catchphrase, "And that's the bottom line, 'cause Stone Cold said so." He mentioned that the 316 bit was influenced by fans waving signs at football games in the South, quoting John 3:16. It's fascinating to see how these sayings came to life. Then there's Austin's origin story. He grew up in Victoria, Texas, and figured it'd be ridiculous to say he was from Austin, Texas. His wife joked that he likes his tea stone cold, and I'll admit, as a kid, I thought it was all about him liking his beer cold. And that intense look he had. He drew inspiration from serial killers, just like The Undertaker borrowed some of his moves from Michael Myers in those Halloween flicks. After King of the Ring, the following episode of Monday Night Raw was a goldmine for Austin 3:16 signs. Suddenly, he was a megastar. But Raw was still struggling in the ratings, and with WrestleMania season on the horizon, Vince knew he had to pull a rabbit out of his hat. That's when he brought in the baddest man on the planet, Mike Tyson. This was a risky move. Tyson had just come out of prison after serving time for rape. Vince was playing Russian roulette, but this time, he hit the jackpot. Tyson would serve as the special guest referee for the match between Shawn Michaels and Stone Cold, and spoiler alert, Austin won the title. Vince stepped into the ring, playing the role of the disapproving boss, which set up a clash between conservative culture and the counterculture that Austin represented. As Austin put it, in any other era, he'd be the villain. But in the Attitude Era, he was the heroic anti-hero. The lines blurred between reality and performance. Fans genuinely believed Austin's defiance against Vince was real, making it all the more electrifying. Tony Atlas hits the nail on the head when he says Vince flipped the wrestling formula on its head. During the Attitude Era, it wasn't just good guys versus bad guys. It was bad guys versus worse guys. In a world where chaos reigned supreme, that was the magic of wrestling at the time. Vince McMahon's philosophy, it's a hell of a ride. He's not out there trying to set trends. He's lurking in the shadows, waiting to capitalize on what's already hot. Think about it. Nobody gave a damn about the good guys. They wanted the bad guys. Villains strutting around like they owned the place. Look at the 90s. The Crow was all the rage, an anti-hero with a chip on his shoulder. Video games? Forget about it. Mortal Kombat had characters ripping each other apart and people were eating it up. Then you had Marilyn Manson pushing every boundary he could find, dragging the audience along for the wild ride. Vince nailed it when he said the Attitude Era was like the Wild West, lawlessness, outlaws, and a whole lot of chaos. Now here's where it gets juicy. One of Vince's former television managers spills the beans about Stone Cold Steve Austin. The reason folks loved him? They wished they could channel that same reckless disregard for authority, the kind that let them stomp a mud hole in their boss's ass. It was a vicarious thrill, watching Austin get away with mayhem and disrespect. He was the walking fantasy of every frustrated worker bee who just wanted to flip the bird to their boss. Stone Cold's larger-than-life character? That was the magic. This wasn't just a guy in a ring. He was a goddamn cartoon come to life. Vince's whole shtick was about cranking everything up to 11, and it worked. Remember that time he wheeled out attack dogs to keep Stone Cold at bay? Or the moment Austin kidnapped Vince and threatened him with a gun that turned out to be a flag that said, "Bang"? Classic. Vince practically peed himself on camera, crying like a baby as the audience showered him with trash. It was like watching a South Park episode on steroids. Bruce Prichard points out that Vince was the ultimate heel. People hated him because he was the rich asshole in the fancy cars, tailored suits, and a body that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. He had the power to control the show, cutting cameras and handing out advantages like candy. That made him easy to despise. Vince was the ultimate villain, and boy did he play the part to perfection. But let's get real. Vince's character wasn't just some random creation. It was shaped by his childhood. Growing up dirt poor, he had a front row seat to the arrogance of the wealthy. He saw rich folks as bullies who used intimidation to get their way. And you bet he wanted to fight back. That childhood pain fueled the conflict between him and Stone Cold, two forces of nature clashing in a spectacle that left the audience breathless. Vince got a kick out of being the bad guy. Manipulating the audience gave him a rush. It was power, pure and simple. It's like he was channeling his own childhood trauma, where his father was more of a business partner than a dad, leaving him to fend for himself while dealing with a stepfather who was straight up abusive. That kind of neglect, it'll twist you up inside. It's no wonder Vince became a master manipulator, craving that cathartic release that comes from pulling the strings. Van nailed it when he said, "Emotion sells tickets." People forget their lives when they're wrapped up in the drama. Get them emotionally invested, and you've got them hooked. That's a lesson AEW needs to take to heart. Storytelling and character matter, plain and simple. Vince also threw out a gem. Performing is easy, but being yourself is hard. That's a hell of a statement coming from a guy who built an empire on larger-than-life personas. When it comes to the Mr. McMahon character, Vince insists they're not the same, but let's be real. Bruce Prichard argues it's just a dialed-up version of Vince. Some wrestlers disagree, claiming they're practically identical. Hulk Hogan even chimed in, saying they're one and the same. Meanwhile, Vince will look you dead in the eye and insist they're different. Classic. And yeah, sometimes Vince would explode, and folks would think it's just him being Mr. McMahon. But no, he's just passionate as hell about his business. When things go sideways, he's going to react, and it's not always pretty. In the interview, there's a significant discussion with The Rock about his turning point when he joined the Nation of Domination. Vince McMahon allowed him to cut a promo explaining his decision, giving him the opportunity to articulate himself as a heel. This pivotal moment catapulted him to become the hottest heel character in the company within a month. When Vince informed him he would be the WWF champion, it resonated deeply with The Rock, who acknowledged being the first person of color to hold the title. Vince, however, framed it as a business decision, stating it wasn't about race, but about making money. This perspective raises questions, especially given the accusations against Vince of racism or perpetuating stereotypes with black wrestlers. While The Rock's achievement is notable, it also highlights the complexities of representation in wrestling, particularly with Kofi Kingston being recognized as the first African-American champion only in 2019. Tony Atlas echoes this sentiment, noting that Vince sees only green, money, rather than black or white. The shift during the Attitude Era is striking. Wrestlers transitioned from mere television appearances to dominating mainstream culture. The Rock's presence at the Republican National Convention and Triple H's stint on The Late Show with David Letterman exemplify this newfound celebrity status. Unlike the 1980s, where Hulk Hogan was the singular star, the 1990s saw multiple wrestlers, including The Rock, sharing the spotlight, which undoubtedly benefited business. However, this surge in fame also brought immense pressure as the expectation to maintain megastar status loomed large. Television announcers from the 1990s noted that the Attitude Era attracted more teenage viewers than Monday Night Football and the World Series combined, propelling WWF into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Wrestling historian Dave Meltzer reflects on the era's appeal, emphasizing how it resonated with the counterculture and anti-establishment sentiments of the 1990s. Those who disagreed were undoubtedly in the minority. Triple H comments on the marketability of being edgy during this time, with excessive blood, sexual content, and humor saturating the programming. He reminisces about controversial moments like Sexual Chocolate, Mark Henry being dominated by women, and the antics of X-Pac. Looking back, he marvels at how much they got away with, acknowledging the stark contrast to today's more sensitive cultural landscape. The WWF's attitude represented a kind of freedom to push boundaries. A particularly humorous moment arises when Vince insists that despite the edgy content, it was still family-friendly, citing a lack of murder. The documentary then juxtaposes this claim with footage of a buried alive match. Vince further claims there was no rape, right before the clip of him shouting at a wrestler, "Come down, you rapist." He concludes by asserting there were no knives or guns, immediately followed by Brian Pillman's infamous home invasion incident, which nearly got the company pulled from the network for its extreme violence. Vince's narrative certainly seems to play tricks on reality. The documentary then features Meltzer, who points out that WWF's marketing strategy claimed to avoid targeting kids, despite the clear presence of young fans at shows. Footage of children flashing middle fingers and performing the suck it gesture complicates this narrative, igniting the debate over responsibility. Should the show tone down its content for kids, or should parents bear the responsibility for their children's choices? This discussion mirrors recent controversies in wrestling, such as the backlash against AEW's All Out PPV in September 2024, where violence in a match between Swerve Strickland and Hangman Page raised alarms because it included a segment on the weekly show where Adam Page burns down Swerve's house, and the match included a spot where they would throw each other on a cinder block, and then another spot where Adam Page put a syringe in Strickland's mouth before hitting him hard as possible with a chair, with syringe still dangling from his mouth. As both promotions aim for a TV-14 rating, the question remains, where does parental responsibility end, and where does the onus on the promotion begin? Footage from the Attitude Era shows kids in the audience engaging in the suck it gesture, prompting a discussion about WWE's marketing strategy. Critics argue that WWE was pandering to children, especially given the popularity of action figures during this time, typically a product aimed at kids, which undermines the claim that they were solely targeting adults. A clip features a principal expressing concern about professional wrestling's negative impact on children, followed by Vince McMahon's nonchalant response, asserting that the principal is entitled to his opinion. There's a claim outside the documentary that McMahon may be responsible for the most amount of suspensions and expulsions in American public schools, as kids emulated the antics seen on WWF programming. Vince's assertion, "This is America, we have freedom of choice. If you don't like us, don't watch," resonates with some viewers. It suggests that content should not be toned down for the sake of children. This perspective parallels how mainstream news often presents graphic content, such as violent images of war or discussions of sexual scandals, without the same scrutiny. News outlets don't receive TVMA ratings for this content, nor do they often consider the impact on children when replaying traumatic events, like the September 11 attacks. For those who are too young to remember, that after September 11, the news would replay footage of the Twin Towers going down. Sometimes you would see that hundreds of times a day. And there were some conversations about how that was very insensitive, the same way people have arguments about WWF being insensitive. This brings to mind a thought from Anthony Burgess, author of A Clockwork Orange, who argued that if we were to ban anything that inspires violence, we should start with the Bible, which has historically been associated with inspiring the most acts of violence in all of human history. Vince's unapologetic attitude is a key part of his charisma. He stands firm in his beliefs, disregarding public opinion, which many respect. In a culture where people often back down, Vince embodies the alpha male archetype, someone who doesn't shy away from confrontation and knows how to assert himself. Shawn Michaels adds another layer to this discussion. While he initially championed the idea of parents, not the WWF, raising their children, he later reflected on the Attitude Era with a more critical eye, particularly regarding the treatment of women. He recalls a regrettable moment when Vince told a female wrestler, "Stop your grinning and drop your linen," a segment designed to elicit a crude reaction from the crowd. The documentary also revisits controversial moments, such as the Nation of Domination segment where The Rock orchestrated a scenario that many interpret as sexual harassment. Critics have called out this segment for its implication of sexual assault, highlighting the troubling nature of the content that Vince approved for his show. Dave Meltzer comments on the audience demographics, noting that it was primarily teenage boys who were being catered to, evidenced by clips of female wrestlers in revealing outfits eliciting cheers from young fans. This underscores the idea that WWE was marketing to teenage boys, capitalizing on the notion that sex sells. Trish Stratus shares her experience, emphasizing that women in wrestling were often viewed simply as eye candy. Clips from the era showcase female wrestlers in provocative scenarios, including the controversial group PMS. Stratus acknowledges Sable's role in redefining how women were perceived in wrestling. She was not only sexualized but also athletic, demonstrating that women could compete in the ring. Bruce Pritchard and Stratus argue that the Attitude Era mirrored societal trends, influenced by shows like Jerry Springer and Howard Stern. They note that the 90s reflected a cultural shift, with a sexual revolution reminiscent of the 60s and 70s, pushing against the conservative values prevalent in the 80s. The era's counterculture embraced profanity and anti-authoritarian sentiments, fueled by increased media exposure to sexual situations. The impact of pop stars like Christina Aguilera and Britney Spears, both embodying hypersexualized imagery, further illustrates how society in the 90s became more permissive regarding sexual expression. This connection between wrestling and broader cultural trends invites deeper conversations about the responsibility of media creators in shaping societal norms and values, especially when it comes to the portrayal of women and the messages sent to impressionable audiences. The documentary's exploration of the Attitude Era delves deep into the complexities of Vince McMahon's leadership and the cultural context of the time. The discussion surrounding bra and panty matches exemplifies the tension between entertainment and ethics in professional wrestling. Bruce Pritchard's commentary highlights how such matches were emblematic of the era's approach to female talent, sexually charged and often objectifying, reflecting broader societal trends of the 90s. While McMahon's assertion that these segments garnered high ratings underscores a business mindset focused on profit, it raises questions about the ethical implications of prioritizing ratings over respectful representation of women. Stephanie McMahon's acknowledgement that the company sometimes took it too far indicates a level of introspection within WWE, suggesting that the leadership is aware of the problematic nature of certain content, even if they were initially driven by audience demand. The controversial segments, including the topless diva and mud wrestling matches, serve as reminders of the excesses of the era, potentially reinforcing misogynistic stereotypes while also highlighting the industry's tendency to exploit sensationalism for views. Triple H's philosophical musings about the audience's complicity in these portrayals introduce an intriguing moral dilemma. While it's easy to criticize the company for its choices, the audience's engagement with such content complicates the narrative. It raises questions about collective responsibility. Can the company be fully blamed if the audience is actively consuming and supporting the content? This dynamic reflects broader societal issues around media consumption and the implications of what is deemed acceptable or entertaining. My comparison to the pornography industry further emphasizes the ethical quandaries surrounding exploitation and objectification. Just as in wrestling, the creation and consumption of adult content raise questions about responsibility, both for producers who profit from exploitation and for consumers who drive demand. My analogy invites viewers to ponder the moral implications of their entertainment choices and whether they support systems that perpetuate harm. The documentary's transition to discussing Owen Hart illustrates the darker side of McMahon's approach to wrestling. Hart's experience with workplace retaliation and the humiliating gimmicks he was subjected to highlight a troubling pattern of behavior from McMahon. The portrayal of Owen's tragic death, juxtaposed with the blue blazer gimmick, serves to underscore the consequences of McMahon's penchant for comedic and often degrading storylines. This pattern raises alarms about the treatment of talent and the prioritization of entertainment value over wrestler dignity and safety. Vince's dismissal of Bret Hart's concerns about Owen's character development as merely a matter of ego further complicates the narrative. It suggests a lack of empathy and an unwillingness to acknowledge the impact of his decisions on the lives of his wrestlers. The examples of wrestlers like Keith Lee and Natalya Hart, who faced embarrassing gimmicks, Keith wearing basketball clothes that made it look like he was wearing a skirt and was also a very poor dresser, and Natalya having a gimmick where she had an excessive farting issue, paint a picture of a culture where humiliation was a tool used to assert power and control. As the episode progresses toward the tragic conclusion of Owen Hart's life, viewers are left grappling with their feelings about Vince McMahon. The documentary's structure, oscillating between celebrating the Attitude Era's impact and confronting its darker aspects, forces viewers to confront the complexities of McMahon's legacy. Is he a visionary who reshaped wrestling, or is he a figure whose decisions caused real harm? This ambiguity invites reflection on the nature of entertainment, the responsibilities of creators, and the ethical implications of consuming content that may perpetuate harmful stereotypes and exploit its performers. The conclusion, with its heavy emotional weight, underscores the tension between the excitement of wrestling's rise and the sobering realities faced by those within the industry. At the end of the interview, they bring up the over-the-edge incident. Owen Hart, dressed as the Blue Blazer, was supposed to drop into the ring from above, but the cable wasn't meant to hold his weight. He fell, hit the ropes, and was rushed to the hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. It's a tough truth. He didn't make it to the hospital. He was declared dead right there in the arena. Despite the horror unfolding, Vince McMahon made a controversial call. The show must go on. Wrestlers who had just witnessed the tragedy were told to keep performing, even with bloodstains still on the mat. The culture of professional wrestling in the 1990s was different. Social media wasn't a factor, and the conversation around safety and responsibility was limited. People talked, but the pressure on the WWF to change didn't materialize in the same way it might today. Some fans confused timelines, mixing up Owen's fall with Mick Foley's Hell in a Cell match. But those were separate incidents, and if Foley had wanted to attempt something similar afterward, the timing would have been questioned. Vince later remarked that the blackout saved the audience from seeing Owen fall. His focus was on the business side. If the fans had witnessed the tragedy, it would have tainted their memories of the event. Vince's comments reveal a man more concerned with profits than the human cost of the situation. He seemed to view Owen's death through a business lens, wanting to redirect attention back to the show rather than absorb the gravity of what had just happened. He said fans didn't come to see someone die, they came for entertainment, and he was determined to keep that narrative intact. The wrestlers, despite their grief, felt the pressure to entertain. Footage showed them performing near the bloodstains left in the ring, a chilling contrast to the horror they had just witnessed. Vince's mentality was clear: keep moving forward, no matter the cost. He claimed that if it had been him or his son in that situation, he would have wanted the show to continue. Even today, he stood by that choice, revealing a stark business-first mentality. The juxtaposition of Vince at Owen's funeral, alongside his son, further highlighted the disconnect between personal loss and corporate responsibility. Bret Hart, grappling with the aftermath of Owen's death, reflected on how deeply it affected him. He spoke about feeling that perhaps the WWF had a hand in this tragedy, a sentiment born out of anger and grief. In the end, The Kansas City police deemed Owen's death an accident, a case of neglect rather than a crime. Although Bret had issues with Vince, he eventually forgave him on a personal level, though their business relationship remained strained. The incident was a turning point, a tragic reminder of the risks taken in the name of entertainment. The documentary footage concludes with Vince McMahon and other wrestlers discussing the intensity of the Attitude Era. Fans were insatiable, with Bret Hart describing them as a bunch of rabid dogs always craving more. Vince acknowledges this hunger for spectacle, which is underscored by a montage of wrestlers enduring extreme stunts, getting hit by cars, falling off ladders, the Hardy Boys executing death-defying leaps, Mick Foley being thrown off Hell in a Cell, Kane set on fire, and an array of sexualized content. Then a voice, likely Edge's, poses a haunting question. When does it stop? The screen flashes with unsettling imagery, including Chris Benoit and crime scene tape, hinting at the next episode's focus on the Benoit tragedy. This marks a significant shift, leading into the PG era that followed the chaos of the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression eras. The emotional weight of discussing Owen Hart is palpable, adding depth to the narrative. The first part of the episode captivates viewers, presenting Vince as a bold figure, unapologetic in his pursuit of entertainment. However, the documentary paints a dual portrait of Vince McMahon. On one hand, he is like Walt Disney, crafting a beloved form of entertainment that brings joy to many. On the other, he embodies sociopathy, revealing a man who only shows concern for wrestlers when it aligns with business interests. The structure of the documentary is compelling, effectively illustrating Vince's complexity. It avoids melodrama, steering clear of the anti-WWF propaganda typical of shows like Dark Side of the Ring. Instead, this series delves into Vince's psyche, exposing the unapologetic mentality required to survive in the wrestling business. This mindset, while successful, hints at deeper sociopathic tendencies, a reality that becomes increasingly evident throughout the episodes.